Thanks. Okay, thanks, Gina. We're really excited to have everybody here. As Gina said, this is the ACRL Instruction Section Teaching Methods Committee's 2023 virtual event. I'm Cecilia, I'm on that committee, and I work at the University of Virginia. We're really excited to have everybody here today for a great presentation titled Teaching Material, Visual and Political Literacy, Primary Sources in Library Instruction by a group of folks at the University of Kentucky. Today we have J. Marie Bravent, Graduate Outreach and Teaching Archivist in the Special Collections Research Center. Anu Kasarabada, the John G. Hayburn Archivist in the Special Collections Research Center. Taylor Lee, the Hispanic Studies and Political Science Librarian in the William T. Young Library. And Colleen Barrett, the Rare Books Librarian in the Special Collections Research Center. I'm going to turn it over to them in just a second. I have a few quick housekeeping things first. First of all, as Gina said, please put your questions in the chat. You can feel free to do so throughout the presentation. Rachel, who's also on the Teaching Methods Committee, will and I will keep track of those and make sure they get answered. You also get an email with the recording of this event and a couple of other links and stuff that we share throughout the presentation. And also please be on the lookout for the brief survey that we'll be sharing at the end of the event. We do look at those results and as we plan for the next year's event. So with that said, I will go ahead and turn it over to the University of Kentucky folks and look forward to a great presentation.
Thanks, Cecilia. Thanks to everyone for joining us this afternoon. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Does everything look good? All right. So my name is J. Marie Bravent, and I serve as an instruction archivist at the University of Kentucky Special Collections Research Center. I primarily work with upper-level undergraduates and graduate students at this point in time, but I've been at UK since 2013, and for the last 10 years, I've worked with primary source instruction across all disciplines in college and have been able to work with disciplines in many venues. So today I'm going to be talking to you specifically about art and visual literacy and a recent collaboration that I've been able to work with the education department, a faculty member there, on integrating the Kentucky K-5 social studies standards into an art class. And this was a particularly a delightful collaboration that I've been glad to work with and that I'm happy to share with you all today, because I started off my undergraduate college career thinking I was going to be a social studies teacher with an art minor. And that was before I discovered the Special Collections Library and being an archivist as a career path. So this really got me back to my roots, and I've really enjoyed this. I'm glad to share it with you all today. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the course description, the purpose of the course. We'll discuss the instructor's desired learning outcomes and how I was able to connect those to the guidelines for primary source literacy. We'll go over the activity and the materials that we used for the activity and how that was developed, and then the class discussion questions, and then also the session resources and takeaways for the students in the class. So the College of Education at the University of Kentucky holds an annual orientation fair every August, and I've been able to go to that just about every year since 2013. And there's usually a group of us from Special Collections and the main library that get together. We have a couple tables. There's folks from the education library. So we've been able to have an opportunity to create some good collaborations through this outreach event. So this past August, I met Dr. Jody Stokes-Casey at the fair, and Dr. Stokes-Casey made a request through our new online instruction form for this new class that was being developed. So we got to get a submission of the syllabus ahead of time, look at the desired learning outcomes, and start putting the class together last August. So this is an Education 200 course. It's a workshop for design education for elementary teachers. It's a 90-minute class that meets twice a week, and most of them are upper-level undergraduates, education majors. It's one of the optional required electives for all education majors, so there could be students from all teaching specializations in this class, not just elementary school. But for the most part, that's the students who are taking this, juniors and seniors who are planning on being elementary school teachers, either art teachers or general instruction teachers. So we had sessions at the Special Collections Research Center in August of 2022, and then again this past February, just recently, a few weeks ago. So Dr. Stokes-Casey had sent me a little narrative about what she was looking for as far as learning outcomes for the course. And we met on Zoom and talked a few times, had a few consultation meetings, and it became clear that what we were talking about was she wanted the students to have a model activity, to basically go through the process of being a student themselves, as if they were going to be students in an art class that was having social studies and history integrated into an art project, that they could experience, and then that they could use that activity as a model for creating their own curriculum, assignments, and applying the new K-5 standards, and starting to think about curriculum and how transdisciplinary educational processes could be part of their classroom. So she really wanted some visually interesting primary sources that would be accessible to K-5 students. We developed a teach the teacher model that would integrate the standards and the primary source guidelines, which I would also discuss in the course with the education majors. We discussed how to create active learning and hands-on with physical items, activities, and then be able to discuss how the students could then adapt those same types of activities to digital resources and digital primary sources. If they had an NTI day, just kind of thinking about primary sources in a broad sense, not just physical items, but digital items. We would integrate sample questions and a worksheet into the activity, and then we would allow for different types of active learning, classroom participation type things. So the students have the option of working individually. They could work in pairs. They could work in groups. I usually like to let my students in these sessions decide how they want to work with the primary sources and their level of engagement, social engagement, and try to be multimodal in the classroom as much as possible. And then we would talk a little bit more about how they could turn the model activity into some examples for their own classrooms going forward. So really, just to sum up, it's all about getting the education majors thinking about primary sources in different ways across different disciplines, not just for art, not just for social studies, not just for science, but they could use these in their classrooms and for many purposes. And then how to find the primary sources online as much as possible, and then the concept of transdisciplinary teaching. We would do an overview of the actual standards. There's a lot of text on this slide, and these will be available afterwards if anybody wants to look at them. But primary sources and the concept of being a part of a community, part of a local community, a global community that has a past that influences today, is going to be part of the K-5 standards from kindergarten all the way through. So getting the future teachers thinking about this now before they get in the classroom is important. And then introducing the students to the concept of applying learning outcomes in their classroom. We were able to model choosing a few of these. So reading, understanding, and summarizing, and identifying just what is this source, just thinking about the primary source as an object, as an artifact, and being able to describe it and understand it first, and then taking that and taking those skills and moving next into interpreting them and looking for biases, looking for context, looking for audience, and starting to take that primary source and placing it in its own past, its own community, and for students to be able to see their identities and all of the different factors involved in what creates primary sources and their place in society, and build from there. And then again, just handling the primary sources. What does that mean? What makes them fragile? What makes them unique? Their attributes as a physical item, sort of as a secondary learning outcome, in addition to just historical empathy and appreciation for primary sources and history in general. So we had a 90-minute session, which was great. I love when I have a 90-minute instruction session. So we were able to do a full introduction, doing a review of what are special collections, what is an archive, how is that the same or different from a main library, all the different types of primary sources and why you would find them in different venues. And then looking at our digital repository, our online digital library, Explore UK, reviewing a little bit about how to find primary sources there, and then also other databases that are available to the students at the University of Kentucky where they can find additional primary sources. So from there, we would take a moment, switch to the activity where we would introduce the concept of working with primary sources, discuss handling the materials, I would review the activity worksheets very quickly with them and explain how they're going to move through the different parts of the activity. Give them a sense of the time frame. They're going to have about 30 minutes to work on this. So they could kind of, from the beginning, think about how to parse out their time with the documents, and what the expectations were, what they should be thinking about throughout the activity. And then I would hand out the primary sources and we would start. So there are three different sort of stations as part of the activity that different groups would get different sets of resources. So one of the examples is a postcard collection activity. So students would be able to look at very visual and colorful and creative aspects of postcards, Kentucky history. We use these postcards. They're very useful in a lot of different contexts for teaching Kentucky history. It's a very large collection. So students can start to identify their uses and think about postcards in the context of how do people use these to communicate certain types of information in the past, and how do we communicate that kind of information today, perhaps with social media or other digital forms. This is the worksheet for that particular activity, which will, again, they'll be available to everyone participating in the session today through a link at the end of the session. But this activity shows how the students should move through just identifying the different components and contexts of the sources, and then into comparing and contrasting and thinking about them in a critical way. The second activity is maps and guides. These are also another fun resource that are visually interesting, where students can look at the purpose of advertising and tourism and the different types of travel aspects from the 1940s, and then start to compare them to how we do this today. This was really fun. The students were able to come up with a sample activity that they could do with their own art students in their own classrooms, where students could create a map of their own hometown. They could create advertisements for businesses from their own hometown, or put together like a little tourist package for somebody who might visit their hometown. It was really fun. So this is an activity that the students had really were able to grasp onto, compare and contrast these types of little booklets to things like Google Maps or MapQuest, or different ways that we travel today. And then the third activity, I changed it up. In October, I used some oversized photographs of student protests, and the students had a really hard time getting past the images and starting to think about how to use photographs just in general in their class. So I switched it up for February, and I found a collection from a Lexington educator who had saved a bunch of travel ephemera and had diaries from their travel. There were pictures, photographs, clippings, brochures, menus, all types of travel ephemera and memorabilia. And the students were able to kind of see what that might be like in somebody's personal archive, and think about how students could create a personal archive of places they've been, or seeing themselves traveling in the future where they might like to go, starting to actually connect a little bit to the global aspects of the Kentucky standards that come into the 4th and 5th grade elements. And then again, here's the activity specifically for the diaries and travel memorabilia. So after the students worked through the worksheets, thought about these materials in context, as far as curricular items, and what they could do with them in an art classroom, how they could integrate things like historical ideas with different types of assignments. We sat for a few minutes and discussed these post-activity discussion questions. So how could they apply these in their classroom? Getting them thinking about different types of challenges and how they might overcome them with the students in their classrooms. What might be age appropriate for kindergarten, 1st grade classroom, how they could adapt it for a 4th or 5th grade classroom. We had really great discussions, and the students were able to take this and really run with it. So then we talked a little bit as part of the wrap up for the session on sort of pro tips about working with primary sources in the classroom and creating their own activities and their own sessions going forward, how important it was to keep it simple, just to use a couple of primary sources at once, small groupings of items, try to focus the activity on one little mystery or one little aspect or observation that was really important. Only try to focus on maybe 1 or 2 skills at a time. build in extra time. They saw how long it took just to kind of figure out what they were even looking at and what they meant, and asking lots of questions before they were able to really get into the critical thinking parts and the creativity part of the activity. So they saw that took, a good 30 to 40 minutes just to really move through what was a pretty simple activity for them as college students. So thinking how long would that take a student in a K-5 environment? And then making sure the items were relevant somehow to the student's personal life, that they could make a connection to. Trying to avoid things like overwhelming the students or making things overly complicated, moving too quickly, having too many items to move through, and then trying to make sure that they didn't use sources that were completely out of context. I would then share with them some additional resources that they could use from the Teaching with Primary Sources community. And there was handouts available in class for that they could take with this, or take a screenshot from the PowerPoint slide on the screen. And then we also talked a little bit about some additional links to resources. So our hope moving forward with Dr. Stokes-Casey and I, we've talked about maybe creating a LibGuide for this course going forward, where all of these items will be available to students perpetually throughout the semester. That's for probably for the future for next year as we do this. And then I got some feedback from the students. There's a lot of text here, but it was really gratifying to see that many of these students included the special collections activity as part of their end of semester reflection. And actually, Dr. Stokes-Casey just sent me images of their final art projects for this semester and for last semester. And several of them incorporated the drawings and representations of the primary sources they worked with. They talked about how it was fun and engaging. Several of them discovered that they didn't really like history very much as a subject, but the primary sources were a lot of fun. And that they could connect to them as works of art, that they could connect to them as members of the Kentucky community. So it was really gratifying to see that many of the students got something out of this that they weren't expecting. So that's our Education 200 collaboration for this semester. Thank you very much. I'm going to pass it on now to Colleen.
Thank you, Jay. Hi, everybody. I'll just get myself going. There we go. Good morning, everybody. I'm Colleen Barrett, and I'm the Rare Books Librarian here at the Special Collections Research Center at UK. Today, we're going to be talking about my presentation, More Than Rare, which is about incorporating materiality into library instruction. So we're going to start with a little bit about what I do and move a little bit more into how I think about what I do, and then talk about how that looks in real life with an example from an Introduction to African American Studies course that I've been teaching the past several semesters. And hopefully the overall takeaway for this will be that you can adopt any of these approaches that seem useful and adjust them to your own needs. So I've been at UK since 2019, and I'm only one of several librarians and archivists that contribute to our overall instructional portfolio here in special collections, as well as in the rest of the library generally. For me, this means that instruction is about 15% of my job right now. And that usually manifests itself as 4 to 7 active learning sessions per semester. Because of the quality of our rare books collection and also the university's status as a land-grant institution, I collaborate with teaching faculty both on and off campus. So we have some stuff that nobody else has in the Commonwealth, and we're fortunate that we can support them coming to visit us as well. Most of my activities at this point are synchronous and in person, probably because of the nature of the works themselves. And I'm usually working with upper undergraduate courses or graduate courses. So it tends to be really specific books for really specific courses, which almost always means I'm doing a new prep. And that's just what it is and comes with the job. So I think it might be a little bit helpful to know more about my background and how I come to instruction as an individual. Unlike Jay, I didn't start as someone who thought I was going to do anything with education. On a professional level, I started as a cataloger and then became a bookseller for a little while before I came here. I wasn't formally trained as an instruction librarian. And this means I spent a lot of time looking at items individually and thinking about how people could use them or collect them from different angles. That means now as an instructor, I'm always thinking of things in relation to one another, whether it's through keywords or subject analysis or possible collection connections or similarity of content. And as someone who worked as a vendor, it will be forever hard to shake the urge to sell things. On a professional level, because I'm a special collections worker, I identify with the guidelines for primary source literacy much more than the ACRL framework for information literacy for higher education. But given your all's expertise, when it's possible in this presentation, I'm going to try to mention the frames as I see them fitting into my work. I'm not a framework expert here. I'm also not really an expert in decolonization practices, theory, or approaches, but I really love watching other people's presentations on them, and I'm always trying to adjust my work appropriately. So right now, I believe that due to the deeply colonial nature of the creation of many American rare book collections, like true decolonization for books is more of an end goal to strive for than a truly achievable goal that we can do in a few fiscal years. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. What examples you use, how you talk about power structures, how you cover information survival, it all matters. And one piece that I considered a lot when I was preparing this presentation was Bedouin and Berlat's recent CRL news article, Decolonizing One-Shots, Critical Pedagogies in the ACRL Framework. I'll send you guys a link to that in the presentation afterwards. But something that struck me as really interesting in this article was that a lot of the decolonization suggestions really suited my rare books active learning approaches. Most notably, their suggestion of incorporating an exploration of format and the information cycle as a means of fostering larger explorations of how knowledge systems manufacture and distribute information within the context of their communities. That is basically how I plan most of my activities overall. And theory is great and background's wonderful, but what does that actually look like in real life? I'm glad you asked. Now we're going to get into the more specific example of the work I've done with Dr. Regina Hamilton Townsend's Introduction to African American Studies courses. So you might remember that I recently said I almost always end up with new preps because I tend to do really specialized instruction. This is actually one of the few classes I've been able to run repeatedly, which means I've been able to tinker with it a lot. So I met Dr. Hamilton Townsend in her first semester at the university in fall 2019 when she was teaching the Introduction to African American Studies course here. We seemed to really get along, so I asked if she would want to bring her class in for a visit to the rare books collection. She agreed, and we got to planning from there. I couldn't have asked for a better collaborator in this. She does a great job interacting with both the students and myself, and her enthusiasm is truly contagious and just a pleasure to be around. Since our first visit, we've repeated this pretty much every semester she's been teaching it. And the course tends to go by a few different names, but it's like almost always cross-listed with the Department of African American and Africana Studies. And it usually has about 20 to 35 students in the course. And they're from all different majors at the university. They're not just humanities majors or English majors. And we have some non-traditional students, and there's never any telling which level of which level in college they're at. Like we have freshmen and seniors, it's always a mix. But the one thing that tends to hold true through all of it is that most of them are first-time special collections visitors, and they're pretty used to the concept of interdisciplinarity, as you can tell through the course description that's on the slide. Dr. Hamilton takes a very open interpretation of this. So now you know about the course, we can talk about what Dr. Hamilton Townsend and I fondly call rare book speed dating. So because these are new special collections users, I always seek to avoid what I see as like the two worst outcomes of what happens with a rare book session, because you either have students who are afraid to touch the materials at all because they're worried they're going to break it, or you have people who are thinking of this as a field trip and they sort of check out and aren't really present. So Dr. Hamilton and I work against this through what I think of as kind of structured novelty and movement. So when students get here, They all sit at different tables of like 4 to 6 students at a table, and each table has 2 or 3 rare books on them. And then they receive a worksheet with the number of sections for the tables there are. And they spend time looking at materials at a table until they're asked to rotate to the next table, which means that throughout the class period, they see everything that has been selected for them, and it prevents them from getting like too absorbed in one object or just like not looking at anything at all. And following the session, we've tried a few different ways to kind of wrap up what everybody looked at, either through discussion questions about what they read for the course or what they saw in the material that they were examining today, or even this semester, we actually ended by playing a video game, which was like a really great way to really wrap up the materiality of it all. But I keep talking about these books, and it might be helpful to know what books I'm talking about. So the African American Studies department here really likes reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs right now, which makes total sense because it's one of the only slave narratives that's been written by an enslaved female, and then allows you to get into a lot of deeper things. But the only bad news is we don't actually own a copy of that in special collections. And because of the scarcity of early editions and the distance of that text from the needs and collecting focus of our special collections, we're probably never going to have an early edition of that. However, we do have, and we still collect, William Wells Brown materials because he has a Kentucky connection. So if you need a refresher, William Wells Brown is a Kentucky-born author that was widely credited with writing the first African-American novel. And we actually hold a variety of his works here. A lot of them are in different editions with different publication dates and places. And that makes for like really excellent comparison exercises, regardless of your research experience level, especially if the books are sitting next to each other. And also because this might be the only time that some of these students are in special collections, I tend to pull a few noted high spots that are discussed in class, even if they're not actually read. So like Phyllis Wheatley Peters' poems, we have a first edition, and we also have a first American edition of Equiano. So you have the activity, you've got the books, and you probably want to see the worksheet. And I really need to acknowledge Jay Marie here for always being willing to share their worksheets and approaches with pretty much anyone who asks. This is definitely based on their work and their different approaches. And when I was designing this, I found myself really leaning into the primary source literacy guideline groups of read, understand, summarize, as well as interpret, analyze, and evaluate, because they focused more on individual objects and than the broader concepts of archival use that the other guidelines do. And if we're going to tie this into the framework perspective, I think this really connects with information creation as a process, in that the rare books were produced to convey a message and are shared via a selected delivery method. And it also connects with searching as strategic exploration, and that information is nonlinear and iterative, requiring the evaluation of a range of information sources and the mental flexibility to pursue alternate avenues as new understanding developments. Because like the students are forced to search through the books themselves to find answers for the worksheet that comes with the activity, and that is going to evolve and grow as they see more and more copies available to them. So this is one group of the 6 groups that are on the worksheet, and I try to work from like the broadest, most obvious questions to the most specific based on the items in hand. So you ask for like the title and the publication dates, and then more about the edition themselves, and then circle in more on the individual items and who has used that singular book. So overall, when this happens, and it's been nice to be able to do this a few times, it's generally the goals, and what usually happens is we leave with new users who know they're welcome in special collections, and that they don't need a specific reason to be here or a specific research topic. This does lead to faculty members that are more aware of collection strengths. So even though Dr. Hamilton Townsend knows we don't have the work that they're reading, she now knows a bunch of other works that are related and could be useful for research on her own later. And selfishly and personally, for me, this gave me a way to test an instructional approach that I have now taken and been able to apply to other courses. Thank you. I will now hand it off to Taylor and Anu.
Great, thank you, Colleen. I really like your structured novelty and movement idea. That is definitely something that I think I'm going to try out. So hello, everyone. My name is, and thank you for being with us today. My name is Taylor Lee, and I am the Hispanic Studies and Political Science librarian at the University of Kentucky Libraries. My job duties include instruction and outreach to those departments, as well as collection development.
And my name is Anu Kasarabada, and I am the archivist and oral historian for the John G. Haven II Initiative, a project at UK Libraries Special Collections Research Center focused on documenting the federal courts through archival materials and oral histories.
And we're going to talk to you today about our experience collaborating to provide instruction for political science students, instruction that's based in primary sources.
So Taylor and I first worked together during the spring 2022 semester for an undergraduate course in political science. Then we worked together again this past January to create a workshop for graduate students in the same department. Our second project really built on what we'd done in the first, and we wanted to talk about the progression of that work. So first we'll focus on our spring 2022 collaboration and our takeaways from that, and then we'll talk about the graduate student workshop and what we learned from that experience.
So first, let me provide some details about Political Science 360. This is a mid-level undergraduate course designed to introduce students to a broad range of topics on law and courts. The students are a mix of sophomores and juniors, many of whom are pre-law. And it's also a prerequisite for upper-level political science courses on judicial politics and constitutional law. Now I'll describe the way this collaboration came together. In 2020, Anu contacted me about working together to promote our judicial archival collections to the political science department. The following year, I saw PS 360 in the course catalog, and I contacted Anu to suggest this might be a good fit for some instruction using those materials. Our first step was to email the instructors teaching the different sections of PS 360, both of whom happened to be graduate teaching assistants. I had worked with one of these students before in a research consultation context, where I had helped isolate and extract a specific kind of material from a not so user-friendly database. So I had already established a certain amount of trust with that TA. As a first step, I wrote to the TAs and provided a description of the Hayburn initiative that Anu had given me. Then, once they expressed interest in working together, I put everyone on an email thread to make introductions and begin planning the sessions. Over the course of the next couple of months, we had a mix of Zoom and in-person meetings, and we set up a shared Google folder to store our documentation. I also asked to be added to the Canvas course shell in order to communicate with students and post relevant materials. Ahead of the session, I created a tailored handout for conducting political science judicial research at UK libraries, as well as Mentimeter surveys to help us understand where students were at the beginning and gauge the effectiveness of our instruction at the end. So what you're seeing on this slide is the handout on the left and a couple of the completed Mentimeter polls on the right. Throughout the PS 360 planning and instruction sessions, I was involved and available for planning, liaising, and general support. But as soon as Anu and the TAs had been introduced and had started working through the primary source materials together, I mostly got out of their way. It's important to recognize that different librarians bring different skills and expertise to the table, and that successful collaborations capitalize on each team member's knowledge and skills. So in this instance, it made the most sense for me to serve in a supporting role.
To follow up on Taylor's points, the primary source materials formed the basis for instruction for these two political science sections. So that's where my role began. Primary source instruction is experiential learning. And that's territory that, as you've already heard, has been well mapped out by Jay, Colleen, and another SCRC education archivist colleague of ours, Matt Strandmark. So my work began with locating archival materials that aligned with the instructor's syllabi and met their priorities. Once I did that, we built lesson plans around those materials. The instructors wanted, for example, for the students to see how judges make the decisions that they do. Judges are viewed as people who hand down pronouncements from on high, but the instructors and I talked about how to bring their role down to the level of human beings using their judgment. So that was one objective. One instructor was also interested in her students getting a sense of what it's like to engage in legal research. And then more broadly, they simply wanted to reinforce what they were teaching during the rest of the semester through real world examples that students could connect with in a direct and tangible way. So based on their objectives, we decided to do 2 back-to-back sessions for each instructor's class, totaling 4 sessions altogether. Both instructors referenced Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas throughout the semester as a touchstone for what a variety of political science research tells us about how judges and courts function. Well, the CRC holds the papers of a Supreme Court justice named Stanley Foreman Reed, who was part of the bench that considered Brown in 1954 and 55. So I selected a memo from Reed's papers in which another justice breaks down how he's thinking about the issues at play in Brown. That's what you're seeing on the far left. And then I paired that with news articles, also from the Reed papers, about how Southern white school systems and public officials responded to integration. So students work with those materials on day 1. And then for the second day, which focused on legal research, students worked with a 2004 law clerk memo and a court decision that focused on racial integration in the Jefferson County public school system in Louisville here in Kentucky. So going from Brown in the 50s on day 1 to a Kentucky school system in the early 2000s on day 2 allowed us to talk about how the court's role in integration issues had and hadn't changed over the course of 50 years. And it was grounded in a locality that most of the students were at least somewhat familiar with.
We paired the materials with worksheets that guided their engagement. These worksheets focused both on the content of the primary sources they worked with and served as the basis for a Q&A discussion toward the end of each session. So the worksheet questions focused, for example, on the substance of the Supreme Court memo and news articles, some of which tied back to things we knew they'd already learned in their class. For example, the worksheet included the term legal actors. This is a term they'd become familiar with in the first weeks of the semester. Most of these students had never worked with primary sources before, and they may not have had any context for doing so in this class about the legal system. So it was that much more important that we focus on what exactly they're looking at and then connect that back to what they're doing in the rest of the course. Using familiar terminology like legal actors helped to do that.
In addition to meeting the instructors' learning objectives, the sessions also met some of the primary source learning standards that Jay described earlier, particularly those focused on grasping components of primary source materials, both as a matter of content and interpretation. So, for example, when the students and I discussed Brown in the first session, we talked about how the Supreme Court collection only held news clippings from Southern newspapers, predominantly tracking the opinions of white community members. There was no inclusion of what was being said and debated in the Black press. We then talked about whose viewpoints are taken into account and whose aren't, and what the implications of that might be. So those are some of the kinds of interactions that the materials made possible. And then here's a couple of photos from the spring 2022 sessions. The photo on the right shows students looking at some of the news clippings from the Reed papers.
Following our experience with PS360, we saw the possibility for a stronger collaboration. We envisioned an opportunity to pool our individual knowledge and skills to expose students to the research process in a different way, one that helps them learn how to develop research questions and seek out sources needed to conduct research. The approach we had in mind was grounded in primary sources, first and foremost, while demonstrating the iterative nature of the research process, one that flows back and forth from primary sources to secondary literature. We took a lot of inspiration for our approach from a case study at Claremont College that was written up by Adam Rosencrans, Gail Burrow, and Lisa Crane. And it's published in the book Collaborating for Impact, Special Collections and Liaison Librarian Partnerships. For anyone interested, the citation to that is on the right. So we began to think about how we could promote primary source instruction in other ways within the political science community. We had developed good working relationships with each of the graduate teaching assistants who taught the PS 360 sections, and they provided some valuable constructive feedback. As a result, Anu and I decided to look for ways to improve on this model in the future, and we had the idea of teaching this approach to the teachers, namely graduate teaching assistants. So we got in touch with the Director of Graduate Studies in Political Science, someone with whom both Anu and I had worked with previously, and we scheduled a meeting where we collectively brainstormed the most relevant kind of instruction session for graduate students, and we made plans to host a workshop in the future. The DGS wisely counseled us to promote this event as a teaching skills workshop and not one focused on research skills per se. We took this advice while secretly harboring the belief that this approach could be advantageous for graduate level research as well. So while we asked the graduate students during the workshop to assume the role of undergraduate students, we thought they may well emerge from the session with new ideas for their own research process.
Taking the DGS's perspective into account, as well as our own goals, we developed several objectives for the workshop. We then focused our lesson plan on making a connection between primary and secondary sources in the research project. We wanted to demonstrate how working with one of these resources can inform work with the other, or one category of these resources, for example, primary sources, can inform working with, for example, secondary resources, and vice versa. The workshop itself was 75 minutes long, which is not a lot of time, but we allocated the first half to primary sources, the second half to secondary sources, and about 15 minutes or so to a Q&A discussion. For the primary sources portion, participants engaged with Supreme Court materials related to racially segregated education, as students had done in PS 360. We also added in other archival materials, this time related to international relations and comparative politics, two other areas that the TAs teach at the 100 and 200 levels. So this portion generally followed what we'd done in the PS 360 sessions. What was new, again, was connecting the primary sources to scholarship.
And here's just a photo of that cohort of graduate students working their way through the primary sources in a paired activity. And here's the worksheet I developed to guide those students through the exercise, which consisted of 3 steps. In step 1, I asked them to generate lists of keywords for each concept or theme they've identified from examining the primary sources. Then in step 2, I asked them to use those keywords to find a variety of secondary sources, some of which they might not think about often. And then in step 3, I asked them to reflect on the search process and the kinds of sources they found. I have them compare source types and discuss how they might use each kind in their research. I also prompt them to compare search tools, Google Scholar versus a subject-specific database, for example, and why they might choose one over the other in different scenarios. Finally, I asked them to reflect on the secondary sources they have found to decide whether their topic is viable. It was this part of the exercise, step 3, that I thought was most important, as it prompted students to think critically about how and where they search for sources and how they use each source type in their research project. Upon completion of the workshop, we were thrilled to receive lots of positive feedback from the graduate students and the Director of Graduate Studies. Some of the students communicated their appreciation to us directly, while in other cases, we overheard students making remarks like, "This is what I need to do with my students." Nonetheless, we came away with our own ideas for future instruction sessions, which will hopefully take place next fall. Among other things, we want to, so just to pick one of these bullet points, we want to reflect more on the appropriate amount of structure to provide for each activity. And this is likely going to depend on the audience and our learning objectives. But for undergraduates who may not have had any experience working with primary sources, more structure is likely beneficial. For graduate students, on the other hand, allowing them more leeway in terms of how they engage with the materials may be more appropriate.
We also want to explore ways to make the connection between primary and secondary sources stronger and more clear. Historical materials can be a really generative source for research questions, from the subject matter they may include to the feelings that they can engender in researchers who engage with them. Secondary source research is one way to channel those thoughts and feelings. And so we're interested in how to get to that potential when we get to do similar sessions in the future.
So with that, we'd just like to thank you for your attention today, and we would welcome any thoughts or comments you may have.
Yes, please go ahead. If you have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'll get us started. I had a question actually. And all of you described really interesting, it sounds like very generative activities and classes that you've taught. But I'm curious, where, if any places, did you see students struggling with either with the material or with the activities? I know, Jay Marie, you talked about students sort of struggling with some of the photos that you shared. So if any of you have any sorts of places where you saw students struggling a little bit, I'm just curious where those sticking points might be.
I can go. Colleen, did I interrupt you?
No, I was about to like go. You go.
Okay. Okay. You had a look on your face that said you were going to go. Okay. So I saw struggle in just the subject matter or the documents themselves. You know, there's legal jargon in there. We're dropping them in with some, but not a lot of context. So there's a lot that they don't know about what they're looking at. And they have no real basis for figuring out how to make sense of it. So, you know, we chose Brown versus Board of Education Materials because that's, if they know about any court case, they're going to know about that. So they come in with some perspectives, accurate or not, some facts, accurate or not, it doesn't really matter, but they have some familiar anchoring. But nonetheless, a lot of this, you know, is unfamiliar to them. So the things that they tend to really respond to are the news articles, because that's like, they understand the concept of news articles. They understand, like, you know, wow, they're looking at, you know, a piece of history. So that actually tends to anchor them better to make some sense of what they're seeing in the memo. So it's the legal jargon, what are these judges and justices doing? We have to take some time to walk through that. And in subsequent sections of, especially the PS 260 undergraduate sessions, you know, I take more time to go through all together as a class, some of the language, to like acknowledge that, you know, they're not supposed to know this stuff. And it's not, you know, it's perfectly fine that like a lot of this language is not familiar to them. I encourage them to like ask questions about what are some words that are weird? What are some words that you've never heard of, you know? So it was because of those spring 2022 sessions that I learned, you know, that we have to slow it down much more.
I was mostly just going to say that in this activity, it's usually getting people used to the idea that it is the same set of questions for each table. So like when they sit down, they're like, is this table 2? And it's like, it doesn't matter. You start here and you're going to have the important information. And I think at least students in introductory courses tend to go into activities thinking that this is something to get through, as opposed to like a framework that you can use to get something out of it. So trying to get them to slow down and be like, okay, not everything's going to have a book plate. Not everything's going to have a signature from someone. Why do some of them have this and some of them don't? It's like getting them to think more about like the meta aspects of their research sources.
I think that with primary source instruction in general, we're asking students to make quite a few leaps. And I think today's pointed out several of them, connecting the primary source eventually to a secondary source, and connecting a primary source to how that's going to work in the student's actual research paper itself, connecting it to creating their own final project or perspective. We're basically giving them a couple pieces of a puzzle and asking them to see the final big picture of the puzzle. So it's about figuring out how to get from step A, B, C to that big picture at the end. And depending on whether we're asking them to contextualize it, to see it within a historical context, to see it within a cultural context, within a sense of bias or politics or historical race relations, what is the value of this item to different aspects of people and culture over time. It's all about figuring out how to get them from just those little bitty pieces to that big picture and being able to have them go back and forth. So I think that's ultimately the biggest challenge.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Jay just said. And, you know, as a more of a traditional liaison person, what I see a lot and what really got me interested in this approach that Anu and I talked about was this recurring issue of how problematic or difficult generating a research question is for students. That's something that really they have a hard time with. I'll go and I'll do an instruction session and on research questions, and then afterward I'll get flooded with emails, you know, and then a lot of consultations outside of that. I often find that there's a real problem with their initial research question. So I think primary sources holds a lot of promise for you know, starting the research process there and letting that naturally lead students to a research question, as opposed to asking students to just select one without having seen anything, you know, primary source or secondary source before that point.
All right, we have another question in the chat. Were there certain aspects of working with primary source material that students have found particularly engaging more than others?
I have a really easy answer to this one. And it's mostly that, like, I don't want to only teach courses that only bring out the high spots, but for people who are really excited about subject areas or certain authors, there is really something to be said about book people seeing like a first edition of a book. So I always know that the table that has the Phyllis Wheatley Peters poems is going to be like the really popular table. And so everyone's looking at the books at that table. They might not be looking at the books that are like a series of essays from the 19th century, like 2 tables over, but there's something to be said for occasionally just like geeking out over something like that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the news articles are the thing that people really gravitate to. The languages, you know, so some of the news articles they're looking at in the Brown v. Board case are from 1954 and 55 after oral argument. And so you can see responses from like Southern legislators and school boards who are basically saying, you know, we are going to, if you force segregation, Supreme Court justices, we're just going to close up our school systems. They have like very blunt expressions about Black inferiority. And so the students are aghast at like over and over what recurs is, you know, that they're so direct about it. They had not encountered such direct racism before, or like it being put in such blunt terms. And so that really wakes them up too. It's a reminder to them that like, oh, it's not, these are things that we saw in our textbooks, but this is actually, people like live through this and people talk this way. And so that is they can find relevance to that in their own experiences. And also in the last couple of years, there's been a Supreme Court case called Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard and North Carolina about, you know, using race as a factor in admissions policies. And so they can really connect, and we work hard to intentionally make that connection to, you know, the law clerk memos that they're looking at, the Supreme Court justice memos, because those cases also refer back and cite Brown to show, like, again, how the conversation and how the debate, how the terms of the argument have changed over 50 years and then 70 years to this day. So just that historical materiality of what they're looking at, but also that connection to contemporary debates.
Another thing about news sources for anyone, considering doing something similar is that they're really a treasure trove of, culture at that point. And so I think a lot of times that's what brings students in. So, I've had a chance to work through old issues of the student newspaper here and also the local newspaper of Lexington. And in both cases, I mean, quite honestly, a lot of times it's the advertisements that are just like really enthralling because they're just snapshots of another time. And so sometimes things like that, just, seeing old advertisements can be the hook that gets you in.
Okay, it looks like we have one question in the chat, and looking at the time, this will probably be our last question. I will also just point out that Rachel has dropped a link to our feedback form, and we would appreciate if everybody would fill that out while we were listening to our presenters answer their last question, which is really fantastic presentations. I struggle with finding faculty who want to welcome me into their course, especially my political science folks. Do you have any advice for convincing faculty that we can provide value to their students?
Taylor, you want to go?
That's a great question. That's something that I think a lot of us are constantly working on or working toward. I mean, this is perhaps not the answer you're looking for, but perseverance. That might be the best one that I have. Trying to show a presence. So, sending out those every semester emails that describe the services that you are able to provide. A lot of times I get good responses from that, and being consistent about that. So really doing it at the beginning of every semester, or, even more strategically, do it. You could send out another email when you think they are finalizing their syllabi. And if you can, if you feel comfortable asking to attend a faculty meeting where you give a little spiel about the work you do and how you can be of use to their students, I think that would help a lot. And, this is kind of cliche at this point, but, just latching on to those library allies that do take you up on your offer and invite you to their class and see the benefit in their students' work that you have facilitated. Continuing to stay up to date with them, checking in with them. And then the other primary thing you can do is working with students. And, every time I have a consultation, if it's for a particular course assignment, which it almost always is, I will copy, with the student's permission, copy the instructor on the follow-up email so they see what we're doing. They see that the student is making that extra effort, and they see the instruction that I'm providing. So I think those things can help to address that.
Yeah, I'll just add that if you have the opportunity to meet with new faculty as soon as they get on campus, or to get into the TA orientations, if you're an institution that has teaching assistants, new instructors who are still figuring out how to develop syllabus, if you can hand them some class sessions and some assignments and show them some examples, they're very welcoming, I found to that. If you can't get to some of those faculty members who've been there for a long time and have kind of already got what they have set and they're not looking for new things, try to do outreach events where you can demonstrate the activity in other venues, the resource fairs, orientations, or create an event and invite the class. See if you can get the faculty to have them come on for extra credit. And then once they start to see the value in these different contexts, I've being able to have faculty be like, wait a minute, this would be great actually in the class. So any way that you can demonstrate an activity, do it in a different venue, I would definitely recommend trying that as well.
I think, and this is probably coming from someone who's not a liaison, but remembering that you're not going to win over every single member of the faculty. So if you have one person like Dr. Hamilton Townsend who's going to bring their class pretty much every semester, that's probably worth more than someone who might bring their class every 3 semesters or like do an instruction session with you. So because I have like a close working relationship with her, that's led me to other faculty members. So sometimes if you find one strong person, you're going to find the other people who are open to it and it's going to snowball.
Okay, we are a little over 3 p.m. So I will just say thank you to our presenters from the University of Kentucky for a wonderful and very informative, thought-provoking presentation. Please fill out the feedback form if you haven't yet, and have a great rest of your day, everybody. Thank you for being here.